So now what I'm going to do is I want my character to fire something when I left click. So this is going to require some scripting. But before I even hop into the scripting, I got to think. If I fire something from my character, that means I have to detect not only when I left click to fire, like in a first person video game, but where does my projectile spawn from and how does it move? So before I can even start scripting, I need to figure out where I want the object to spawn from. So let me focus on this guy. Let me bring it to an X value. So if I look at my character, maybe I want it to spawn, like right where my mouse is or so. So what I'm going to have to do in order to work with the programming of Unity, I'm going to have to create an empty game object. And with this empty game object, I'm just going to move it right about here. Now I can't even see the game object unless I click on it, but that's fine because we don't want to see it because this is where our objects spawn from, but that doesn't mean that there's anything there. Now maybe if I model a gun or something, we'll have a gun and then the tip of that gun will be the spawn point where the bullet comes out of. But for simplicity's sake, what we're going to do right now is just have a basic game object with nothing on it that we're going to be able to reference the XYZ coordinates of in a script to tell it to shoot something from that position. So it's kind of confusing, but this is how you start thinking like a game developer. You got to break it down extremely logically because that's what programming is. It's all logic and mathematics. So you really got to start thinking in that sort of way. So now that I have this empty game object here, when I left click on it twice in my hierarchy, I'm going to call this Spawnpoint. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag the spawn point onto the main camera object of my character controller. And what that's going to do is it's going to attach the spawn point to my main camera. So wherever my camera looks around to, my spawn point's going to move with it on its rotation and everything. So this will mean that when we're moving around in our game, if I look up or down, left and right, my spawn point's always going to follow my line of sight. So when I left click, the projectile is always going to end up in front of me firing somewhere. So now my first person controller consists of the graphics object, which is just a capsule, my main camera, and then a spawn point for which my projectile will fire from. Now we want to say that I want a projectile to fly from that spawn point when I left click. This is where we get into scripting. I'm not going to get into scripting too much because really that is an expansive field that if you're interested in game design, you're going to have to learn it and you're going to have to get very intimate with it. So what I'm going to do is I already have a couple scripts that I've written before this video, and specifically I have a projectile script in my project hierarchy here. And if I double click on that, it's going to open up the script in Mono Develop, which is Unity's script editor. Now Unity can either do JavaScript, C#, or Boo. From what I've heard, the majority of people use JavaScript, but it's not JavaScript necessarily as you remember it if you know JavaScript at all. It's what they call a Unity script, which means it's got tons of different functions and things that are built into it through the Unity API. And if you want to get familiar with the Unity API, it's as easy as going up to the Help menu in Mono Develop and clicking Unity API reference, and it's going to bring you to everything you need. So you can just find any function you're looking for and familiarize yourself with what you've got to do. So anyway, let me hop back into Mono Develop. This is the script I wrote. Now, I'm not a programmer. I know some, but this is very simple script, and this only really works for our character. This is not necessarily how you would program a real game, but for the sake of demonstration, this is what I did. So basically, I have a projectile, and I'm assigning a damage variable to that projectile, so it does 5 damage when it hits something. I don't have code in here yet for when it hits something, so that's not really getting applied, but I have an if statement that says when I press the left mouse button or control on my keyboard, it's going to generate an object at my spawn point that we created right here. So when I left click, it's going to create something at this point here, and then it's going to push that object with a velocity call in the forward direction at 20, whatever that measurement is. I don't exactly know, but it's going to move it forward at that rate. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to attach the projectile script to my first-person controller. And now I can see it listed here. Now, what my script is asking for is a rigid body, which is specified up here outside of the update function. The update function is called every frame that Unity is running. So this is where the bulk of your code's going to go. But what I'm doing up here is declaring a rigid body object, which is a physics object within Unity that reacts with the physics of the Unity engine and can collide with objects and things of that nature. The cool thing about Unity is I can specify this up here. I don't have to assign it to anything. All I'm saying is that the projectile is a rigid body object. So now if I go over to my script in the inspector, I can look here and it says, well, it doesn't have a rigid body for the projectile. But then I can say, okay, well, I want one there. So I could click here and go under assets and find stuff if I have it all set up proper. But what I'm going to do is I created a fireball prefab, which is a pre-made game object that has things attached to it already, which you can see here. And if I bring that in, we can kind of see what it looks like. So it's pretty much just a basic game object with some mesh to it. It has a spherical collider and it has an audio source, so it makes a sound when it generates. So I don't need that in my scene right now, but that's what it looks like. So now if I click back on my first-person controller and I look at my projectile, well, I want my projectile to be a fireball. So I'm going to drag that onto my rigid body here, and now that's telling my my game object, my first-person controller, that when I fire something, it's going to shoot the projectile rigid body that I created here. And all I did to create that was I pretty much created an empty game object up front and just started adding components to it that I wanted. You know, so I just added a mesh renderer and a mesh filter with a fiery looking texture. I added an audio source with some audio that I found online that was free, public domain license free audio. And then what I did was I created that and I saved it as a prefab that I could use later in my code, which is what this is. So now that I have my script set up to fire a rigid body, if I hit play, I left click, it's going to shoot a little ball out. If my fireball hits the ground, it creates a little explosion. And you'll notice when I shoot a fireball, it generates a clone down here in the hierarchy, which means the object is existing within our game. Now those clones normally would build up and just start consuming CPU processing power like mad. Just the more and more you get, because that's always stored in the memory of the game. So I have to tell it when it touches the ground to destroy. So what you see happening, I have those clones that flew off the edge. They're not hitting anything, so they're still there. But when I shoot it and it hits the ground, it destroys the clone, but it creates a fireball explode clone. Now, the reason it's doing this is because I'm telling my first-person controller to shoot a fireball object. Now, when I look at my fireball object, well, there's some other scripts applied to this. So I have another script that I created called destroy object. So why don't we go down here and look at my destroy object script. So pretty much my original dilemma was that I was shooting the fireball and it would hit the ground and it would just stay there and keep rolling around and wouldn't do anything. So I said I need it to destroy itself if it touches an object. So what I did was I had to create another script and actually apply it to my fireball, because if my fireball is the object I want destroyed, then the fireball is the one that has to detect the collision and then destroy itself if it hits something. So what I had to do was create a collision data, which is built into the Unity API, and I just told it that if it touches something, to kill itself, to destroy itself from the game, so it's not going to keep taking up CPU power. And besides, it's not very realistic if it touches something and absolutely nothing happens. As we all know from playing video games, things happen when things hit each other. So that's what I did. And to create the explosion, I had to download the detonator package off of Unity's website, which if you just go to Google and type in Unity detonator, you'll find it and you can download it and use it. It's really cool. It allows you to create explosions really quick and easy. And what I had to do was I had to create a secondary game object that gets an empty game object that gets created on top of my fireball when it hits something, and then that empty game object becomes an explosion. It is an explosion. So this allows me to destroy the original clone, but then it creates an explosion that persists for 3 seconds and then disappears. So that's pretty much what my script here is doing. It's not super fancy, but it's allowing me to do what you see on screen. So all my Fireball Explode object is a giant detonator, which, as I said, you can download from Unity's website and add these scripts which come with it. And then I just changed some of the settings around so it looks like it explodes. So now my fireball, I'm able to fire by hitting Control or left click. I'm able to hit stuff, make the object disappear, and it has an explosion, which is pretty cool. So next I'm going to throw in an object that I can shoot at that will move around based on the physics and will take damage based on collision.